Bring this around you, Erica, if that's okay. Yeah. I'm Margaret Cole, and I'm really honored to be leading the discussion with this fabulous panel, wonderful writers, and I think it's going to be a really interesting panel. Okay. Here's what our panel is about. A session that searches the legacy of ancestral cultures through the layers of collective memory. American Indian writers and artists speak of how they resist amnesia and cultural erasure amidst the dislocation of voice and identity as they invoke and celebrate the legacy of the First Nations. I'm hoping my panel is going to tell me what that means. I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you. I have done a lot of research on the Arapaho Indians, one of the Plains Indian tribes that was here in Colorado, and when I read this, the first thing I thought about was what the effort that was made in the late 1900s and the late 1800s and the early 1900s to truly erase the Indian culture. When the children were taken from their families and taken to and placed in Indian schools, one of them, the infamous Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, where they were beaten for using their own language, where really the effort was to destroy the Indian, to kill the Indian so that the white Christian child could survive. And I had an Arapaho friend, an elder, and this was in the 70s, so when I was interviewing him, and he had been taken to one of these schools, and he said, to Carlisle in fact, and he said he used to go out, he'd try to find a time during the day where he could get away, and there was a big tree on the land, and he would go out and sit behind that tree and speak his own language. He was so afraid of losing it. And of course, when you lost your language, you lost your culture. When you came home, which many of them was years before they were able to come home, they couldn't speak to their parents. They couldn't speak to their grandparents. This was truly an attempt to erase culture. But what I've seen, in my experience, and our panelists are going to address this much more profoundly, what I've seen is a really, over the last 20 or 25 years, maybe more, a real resurgence of this really ancient, rich culture in art, in literature, in music, in clothing and dance, in so many ways. So I was a little surprised to read this, that we're still talking about erasure of culture and amnesia and things like that. So I'm eager to hear what our panelists have to say about this. How do you feel about it today? Do you feel that there still is that going on, that effort to erase native cultures and to get us all to forget that we actually have this rich heritage in our country? Anybody?
Yeah, I think definitely there is. The Colonial Machine is still firing on all cylinders. It's still trying to overwrite and, I don't know about erase, but make us invisible, by replacing us with insignias on t-shirts and stuff, And instead of letting us be people, we become merchandise, I guess. So yeah, that definitely goes on. But at the same time, when and if we speak up about that, then we have the moral high ground in the public arena, but we can win that little thing, we shouldn't be on your t-shirt or something, but in winning, we also kind of class ourselves as victims, as people who are being taken advantage of, and I think that's just as bad. So you win the little battle, but you just give more fuel to the big colonial machine, I think.
Yes?
I don't think the government is involved in the same kinds of policies that happened in the 19th century and early 20th century. In fact, the early 20th century saw a lot of change in Indian country in terms of how the government decided to deal with Indians. But the kinds of institutions that they created weren't particularly friendly to Indigenous ways of knowing. And so I think that is one of the big challenges for Indigenous people, is both recovering on some level these deeper ways of knowing. What Linda Hogan calls sort of getting in touch with that terrestrial intelligence. And so I think that that within Indian communities there are efforts in many different ways, sometimes through language programs, often in language programs. Historian Bobby Connor said that there's this huge database of knowledge out there, that's just untapped. And in those languages, different ways of really perceiving and understanding the world, different ways of knowing. And I think even though these are difficult efforts, I know there's a program at UC Berkeley called Breath of Life, Silent No More. And what it endeavors to do is bring people from the community to relearn language and learn language, and then to bring it back to the community in really daily forms, because you can learn language as a linguist, looking at all this sort of meta whatever, but it's really how you use it in a day-to-day, teaching children, and getting them to become cognizant of that world around them in terms of those languages. I think that's a really beautiful effort. There are efforts within reservations themselves to begin to do things sustainably. So looking at indigenous agriculture, indigenous forestry, indigenous ways of fishing, all these kinds of things are things that we're very threatened by government policies, but tribes are making a huge effort to bring some of this back, and it's not just recent. I mean, it's been going on for some time. When we look at the arts, we look at literature, as you mentioned, art. I mean, there's a fantastic amount of beautiful, beautiful work out there that speaks at a range of different kinds of experiences, from the heartbreaking kinds of experiences that Louise Erdrich talks about in, say, The Roundhouse, domestic abuse, in that case, rape on the reservation, to the kinds of work that people like Linda Hogan and Robin Kimmerer write in terms of, re-establishing a connection to the natural world. And I think what we're about really at this point is really trying to establish those connections and bring those to other people as well.
So, are you saying then you see hope here?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. That's a good thing. So you're all writers. We have poets here, and we have a whole. You've written a range of things, all of you. How do you feel, or what? As a writer, how do you stay in touch with your own culture and work it into the things that you are writing? Are you conscious of doing that when you're writing?
I think it informs us of just writing itself. It's really a part of my identity, and a lot of my work really deals with this idea of memory. And when I say memory, I'm not just talking about what we remember from yesterday, but it talks about where our bodies have been and where they've come from, our bloodlines, the stories. A lot of the work that I look at, I try to look not only at myself, but how that is being transformed as I move forward. I'm working on a collection now called Genesis Redacted, and a lot of that work really stems from this idea of this conversation that I've had with my mother, and during that moment when she was carrying me in utero. And I've never really had the opportunity of having that kind of conversation with her before, and what she was thinking and what she was doing, because even in that moment of my emergence, there was an influence there that was happening. And as I was having that conversation with her, I don't remember much of what happened then. And I know I was a conscious person, but that consciousness was being lived through the presence of my mother and how she was moving about in the world. And I think that's sort of a really important thing that we have to sort of keep in mind as we look around is, how do we choose to participate in that memory? And that memory sort of has a lot to do with historical context. It has a lot to do with language. It has a lot to do with just who we are, you know, and how we choose to recognize that. And a lot of times, you know, it's easy to forget where we are in terms of an identity. I mean, we're dealing with the United States here. What does that mean? My family's been dealing with it since the beginning of time. You know, how have we lost ourselves in that progression? I speak Apache, I speak Navajo, I speak English, but at the same time, I just find it ironic that I find myself as an English teacher, you know, so I don't know.
So as a writer, you're saying you really do deal with this and dig into this and excavate this memory and this legacy that you come from, and you're trying to do that in your work. Is that what you're saying? Did I understand you correctly?
I think you have to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think it's part of my responsibility as a writer, somebody who is passing on stories, because that's part of who I am as a legacy. You know, what am I choosing to pass on? What am I choosing to remember? What am I choosing to sort of divulge? And what am I choosing to sort of be naked in terms of, you know, exposure, being vulnerable? Because, you know, when we talk about writing, writing itself is just not words on a paper or words on a page. They're an expression. It has feeling, it has emotion, it has revelation, you know. And I think that's the power of words. Even in the sounds themselves, you know, you strip everything away, you have 24 letters that you deal with, you know, that write basically themselves and develop an identity, mood, whatever. And it's so revealing, I think, if you allow it to go there.
You've given me the thought that you are the modern day storytellers. And storytelling is a part of the Native American culture. It was always up to the storytellers to pass on the memories and the culture. So, Stephen, talk to us, because you write so many things and different things. You don't just write about your own culture, but how does that, because you're a member of the Blackfeet tribe, how does that influence what you write, your heritage?
As we were talking about the other panel, being Blackfeet, I do occupy a certain political space, but when I sit down to write, I'm not thinking, I'm Blackfeet, I'm Blackfeet, I'm Blackfeet. I'm just thinking, I'm me, I'm me, I'm me. And in the panel description we got, I forget what the wording was, but it was something about ancient ways of knowing, right? And I was thinking, what are my ancient ways of knowing? And I think my ancient ways of knowing are probably the Universal horror movies from the 30s, you know, and I got more contemporary, you know, around the 60s with Herschel Gordon Lewis, and then Stephen King is my current culture I draw on, you know. So, I mean, I think I'm Indian. I can't help being Indian. I don't want to not be Indian, so everything I write is going to be, to me, Indian, even if it doesn't put suns and bears and moons and all the typical signifiers of Indianness on the page in the story. It can't help but be Indian because I'm Indian. You know, that's the way I feel.
Erica, tell us, when you're working on your poetry, and you've also written novels, right? And no.
I do poetry.
Well, tell us. No.
Mainly fiction.
Mainly fiction. I'm gonna let you tell us what you do. But how does your background inform what you write? Are you aware of being a Native and writing as a Native? You talk.
I do have a couple of collections of poetry out, but that part of me seems to have died. So I've let it die. But I don't know. I think this is a really awkward question, and I kind of feel like the problem is that people have these unbelievably, no offense, but grotesquely precious ideas about Native Americans, and frankly, they're oppressive. And they get into us, and then we have to figure out what to do with it. And for me, I feel like, as Janice was mentioning, when you look at, you know, language programs and things that are pragmatic and lovely and traditional or contemporary, whatever, in different Native communities, whether they're in Denver or on the Navajo reservation, those are things that I can kind of understand and grapple with. The rest of it is too amorphous. And I was talking about this on just stupid freaking Facebook the other day. And I was just saying, like, how do we move forward? Because a lot of the Native writers that, not just white people, but young Natives really like, they talk very overtly about racism and about issues, and that stuff is always there in people's work. But it just centers whiteness again, and if you are Salinger or you are Carver, you're not sitting around thinking, but how will Indians think? What will Indians think about this? Every once in a while now, the current culture is like, well, I should feel guilty if I have a really horribly racist character, but also I'm an artist, so I'm gonna do what I want. You know, that's the only thing that you'll see in the reverse. But we are fully immersed in that, and I do everything I can to pretend I'm not.
To pretend you're not Native? Or not what? Or not prejudiced? Or what? Or not what?
To pretend I'm not in this America.
Really? Okay. So, give us some examples. So how do you do that in your writing? How do you do that? How does that manifest itself? That's hard.
I really think about the world that I grew up with and the world that I'm interested in, and I've kind of cultivated I don't really care kind of attitude. Like, Kirkus will call my work vulgar, and I'm like, cool, jerk, bye. You know, I just hang up the phone. And I have a kind of, I know I look kind of hilariously femme, but a kind of masculine ability to be like, I am not gonna care about that. And I'm gonna care about, like Vonnegut, he had said, you know, you only have to write for one person, and for him that was his sister, and I thought, well, I think that's about right for me. You know, I'm not gonna care about what the Natives think about where I come from, although I care more about that than what this amorphous white people or universal care about. But I'm just going to care about, like, maybe what my sister thinks, but then I'm just going to probably argue with her too.
Stephen, you said that in a previous panel. You said you just need to care about what your cousin, who laughs at all your jokes, care about what he thinks. Write for him because he's going to like what you write. So I think what you're saying is maybe what all of us writers need to think about, and that is not think about what other people are going to think about us and just write what we have to write and what we want to write and the story that's come to us. Janice, want to add to this?
Sure. I guess I'm a California Indian. My tribal affiliation is Koyunkawe or Konkau. And so I think a show of hands would tell us not too many people have heard about that tribe. So a lot of my writing, I think, or at least part of my writing, part of the project is to really somehow bring us to life, bring my family to life. And talk about an experience that, as a mixed blood person, as a person who's mixed in different ways, who grew up urban, like many of us do, many Native people do, grew up middle class, grew up as a lesbian, grew up like in lots of different ways, but also to keep going back to those older stories, the stories that my mom told and my auntie, and even before that, because the California they lived in, my grandparents were born in the late 1860s and early 1870s. My mom was the last of 14 kids. So that was a very different country 100 years ago, very rural, and we didn't have a reservation. It was the north part of the Mother Lode country, and so people are impacted differently and have different histories and different ways of telling those histories. But for me, a major project really has been to try and make that history meaningful, because it's one that I think doesn't get told often. Do any of you, do you think about your audience? Who do
you write for? Do you think of anybody out there who's reading? Is there a particular person? Is it a native? Or is it just your cousin? Or, you know, are you writing for, you know?
I think more and more, like the last probably 15 years, I think of the person I consider to be my nemesis, you know? And I think, he's going to make fun of that line. I got to do that line better, you know? So.
I think as far as poetry, it's really hard to figure out who your audience is. Because, I mean, if you're looking at Native American poetics, you don't want to really, I'm really trying not to fall into that rut of finding places that will only publish Native American writers just because I'm Native. You know, and that's such a hard place to be, because the work that I do, it's really it's finding a hard place to be categorized, because I don't deal with traditional types of poems that, you know, what I see, because I'm a reader for one of the magazines out there, and the types of poems that I see coming in, you know, I just don't feel as strong reading them. And if, you know, for me, if I see that kind of work that it's being published, I mean, what does that really ask of, you know, the writer, you know? Because there's a lot of questions. So, I mean, I really grapple with my own work in terms of, like, who the audience is. And because I deal with, like, my own native language, I deal with Navajo, and I also deal with Apache. Who knows about those concepts, you know, other than ethnographers or linguists or anthropologists, you know? So I don't, you know, finding a niche for myself, you know, and that's the hardest thing, is, and I sort of, you know, don't like myself for that, because I haven't, you know, landed somewhere. But as long as my work is, that I'm producing it, I think that's all that I really care about, is, you know, the writing. The writing comes first, my expression, seeing myself as an artist, you know, that's really where I lie with my own work.
So are you saying that even the native peoples don't know some of the things that you're talking about? You need ethnographers, and you need all these
Well, I mean,
scholars.
if you're going to put your work out, I mean, I think there are Native American people in general. Like, if I were to publish my work, I think people back home would know what I was talking about. But, you know, most of my work, I have footnotes. You know, so I mean, and I shouldn't have to do that as a writer. You know, I mean, that goes back to what Erica was saying about, you know, having to explain and having to always define and always having to put yourself out there. And that I didn't have to make any of those accommodations for living out in the Western world, aside from me learning English and adapting. You know, I speak predominantly English, so I mean, I think I've given a lot up, but I don't think my writing should.
I did my PhD here, and it was not the best experience, but I finished, and the one thing that was very, very good about it is that I had a lot of time and privacy to really cultivate my work and what I thought about this stuff. And one of the things I kept turning to again and again is Langston Hughes's The Negro and the Racial Mountain, because he's essentially saying, he was talking to a young black poet, and they were like, I don't want to be a black poet, I just want to be a poet. And he was like, well, in other words, he got down to it and he was like, they want to be white. And at the same time, you know, I kind of feel like it's a battle between what's organic and what's forced, and how do you ignore the audience, or how do you not ignore the audience? But he was like, at the end of the day, he's like, I think we're ugly and we're beautiful and we're human beings, and we have to write for ourselves, and we have to reflect all of what we are. Like Stephen was saying, I'm me. I'm going to reflect those things organically. And as adversarial as I can be, I'm a professor like all of us, and I tell my students a lot, like, you know, you just got to trust your audience. You know, if they're a worthy audience, they'll get what you're saying. If they're not, you know, they won't. And I think you ultimately have to do that. I think that I want, even if it's a fiction, I tell myself, I do want my job to be the same as Salinger's. He wrote about his tribe. I will imaginatively and poetically write about mine. So.
You do have to find some commonalities, right? Between your tribe and between other people. I mean, if you want to write, it seems to me you're writing about your culture and your legacies. you've got to find a way to transport that into other cultures and other legacies. So you don't worry about that, or how do you feel about that? What are their bridges?
I guess I do it. I write a lot of genre stuff, which is to say fantasy, science fiction, horror, crime. And so the way that I can plug into the audience is I'm ringing all the bells of the detective novel, and so they're like, hey, I recognize this. But while they're recognizing that, I can smuggle something else in that I want to smuggle in.
That's good. I mean, you do have to trust your audience, as you said. You've got to put some responsibility on your audience, but the writer bears responsibility too, to find the bridges that connect all of us and to find a way to communicate. Janice, any thoughts? I see you over there pondering.
I'm not really sure what I want to say about it. I think I don't worry over much about it until I send something to a publisher. Then I start to worry a little bit. Is this going to make any sense to anybody if it gets published? But otherwise, during the writing process, I am not thinking about an audience. I'm just thinking about the work and trying to get it done and trying to make it the work I love.
One thing I could say on that, though, is that when I read other people's work, I see myself as part of that audience, that I'm influenced by writers, and it's those writers that influence the way I see things as well. So there's sort of an alignment that does happen. So, I mean, I may say that, I don't really think of an audience, but if I look at myself reading other people's work, I'm still participating in that realm, if you will. So in terms of who I connect with, I think those types of connections do happen in another audience somewhere.
Yeah, it's a community, right? I mean, ultimately, and that's the thing, it's a big, gigantic, diverse community where writers and readers are constantly participating and caring. And if they're not in this immediately like, this is, I don't know what this is kind of state, we're all going to be able to participate in something new or fresh or different. And I think a lot about, like, for example, like, I love Sandra Cisneros, and I love Junot Diaz, and I love, Jhumpa Lahiri. I love all of those kinds of writers. But I have to admit, I still love, his fans are jerks, but I still love David Foster Wallace, even though I know perfectly well he would have never picked up anything that I would have written. But I still like him.
What feedback do you get for your work? First of all, from Native communities, and then we'll talk about what feedback do you get from outside communities? Anybody? Just go.
I guess as far as feedback, I was on the reservation a few years ago talking to one of my cousins, and I hadn't seen her for a lot of years, and she's saying, remember when you gave that speech for commencement in high school? And I was like, I got invited to do that, but I didn't do it. And she kept telling me all the jokes I made, and I was thinking, well, this is pretty good. But then I realized she thought I was Sherman Alexie, She thought, and so what happens is like all male Indian writers get collapsed into one writer, Which isn't bad.
What about from outside communities?
I was saying I write a lot of genre stuff. My first few novels were very self-consciously American Indian, and I would go do book events and people would keep asking me Indian questions, and I kept thinking they're not engaging the work as the work, they're engaging it as a lens to look at a culture. And so I got sick of that. I said, screw y'all, I'm gonna go do my own thing. And so I write about zombies and werewolves and stuff.
Chris's girl, what kind of feedback have you got?
When I go home, I guess a lot of my relatives don't really know what I do. Because I always go back there and I was like, what do you do? I see you like all over the place on Facebook, you're here and you're there. But I mean, in terms of like a lot of the feedback that I've gotten from a lot of my other writer friends is that, that they like the conversations that I have with them about writing. Because I remember when I was a young writer, I always thought that when you wrote about what was around you, what was your identification, and that meant turquoise and silver jewelry and mesas and tumbleweeds and all that, and And when I was younger, I was really naive, and that was because I wasn't well read. But now that I've had a chance to read a great body of work from a lot of different people, it gives me a better sense of what writing is. And so when I have those conversations with a lot of my writer friends and incorporate some of those in my writing, then I think those are more meaningful conversations. And that puts me out of the scope of what a Native American writer is or a Native American poet is. Like Stephen Graham Jones says, I'm Native American, I can't help that. But, my writing is my writing.
I think that's a common theme they're all saying here. Your writing is your writing. And obviously we all write out of who we are to a certain extent. And so you happen to be Native people, you're going to write out of that. But you're also writing just out of yourself, out of who you are as an individual human being. What about you, Janice? How about your audience? What do you find? Anything? Good? Bad?
I keep a really low profile. I have no idea what people say.
I think what you were saying, Christo, about other writers. I mean, those kinds of conversations that we get to have with other writers are really valuable, because if they're honest with you, and if they're good friends, they will be. They'll really let you know whether you're connecting with them or not, and I value those conversations a lot. Erica, you mentioned that we should talk about some of the craft of writing, which is a huge topic in itself, but very, very important. So how do you see with what you write, and you're writing out of who you are, a Native person, but you're writing about what you want to write about, and so how does that affect your craft? Is your craft, do you work with that? Is there a problem? Any problems that you have to deal with in order to express, who you are and what you want to do?
Well, let me answer the first question, but can I say bad words? And here I'm allowed to say, because I don't want to get kicked out. I wanted to ask, I wanted to talk about audience or peer, how your peers, how people see your work. I've actually done okay in that way for a pretty obscure dude. But who I feared the most, honestly, was Native American female elders, if you will, also including my mother. And so, because I wrote a novel where the first line is, I was sitting in the basement with yet another fucking drug fuck when I decided to get nervous. And the main character is a drug dealer, and she gets pregnant, and she's 15. So I was very, very concerned, A, about how my mother would feel about it, and then B, about how elder Native women would feel about it. Like maybe they would feel like I was saying something, I was kind of too vulgar. And so, and this is sort of my reality in my artistically rendered way. But my mom was really funny. I came home at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had to drive somewhere else as part of the tour. And she plucked my book like right off my bed, and I'm like, ugh, And so she like emails me, and she's like, she's like, at first I was reading it because like, you're my kid. And then she's like, and then I got into it. And so I was like, okay, I feel a little better. And then as I got trashed by Publishers Weekly and Kirkus for being vulgar and all these other things, I actually simultaneously got, pumped up by people like Debbie Reese, who's like a pretty fierce, amazing woman and scholar, and she looks at Native literature and literature that features Natives, and she's very unflinching. And she and every other Native woman like held me up against that criticism, and it was a very touching experience actually, because I am kind of this rough chick, from a slightly rough place, and I kind of wondered how that would look, but I don't know, everyone really held hands and held me against that, held that, maybe protected me, and I felt really, really good. As far as craft goes, I'm really interested in craft. I write on craft. I write on poetics and narratology and Native American fiction and poetry. So I feel like nobody talks about that. They talk a lot about content and how Indian this is because they talk about this ritual or that ritual or whatever. And I'm like, okay, you know, what is actually different on the page? Like, what is, if I'm going to look at it through form, what is actually happening on the page that's different? And I did notice, for example, with Native poetry, especially people who spoke their language, there was a high, like Native languages, they revolve around verbs and not nouns. And so the images and the metaphors were extremely fluid on the page, and it really changed it even in English. And so those are the things that I was really interested in. Like, what does experimental actually mean? You know, what does narrative or traditional actually mean? Because people love to beat each other up with these terms. So I started to really look, all right, what does this actually look like concretely in terms of form on the page? And I think those are things that Native writers care about, even if they're not always vocalizing it. It's right, it's going into our work. So.
Do you think that's limited to Native writers? I mean, is that
my point is that
writers
we also care.
Yes, right, absolutely, yeah. So let me ask this: did you always know you were going to be a writer, or did it just happen one day? You woke up and said, "Oh gosh, I'm going to be a writer today."
My whole life I was going to be a farmer, but then I became a writer, and it's a surprise. But the hours are a lot better.
When I was a young kid, I was an artist first. I was a painter, and it was when I went to art school halfway through, Arthur Z convinced me to be a writer. So I started writing, and I read a lot when I was a kid. It was like the only thing I could do to sort of get out of that reservation kind of staunch. Because I mean, it wasn't a very nice place to grow up. But you know, reading allowed me to sort of remove myself and, you know, sort of think about other things.
Janice, were you always a writer?
No, I was not always a writer, but I liked writing from when I was a little kid and teenager, and then in my 20s, I was trained in music, and so that was the first thing that I worked on. And I still play a lot of music.
Yeah, I don't really know why I decided I wanted to be a writer. Nobody I knew was a writer. And, you know, speaking of the Shermanator, he always has this very mythic way in which he, like, covertly talks about himself. It's kind of funny. He'll be like, I never thought I would be a writer. Well, pretty much, I bet that's a lie. And I think that all of us kind of, at some point or another, just sort of is in the back of our heads kind of burning in there. But I will say that I don't know why I decided that. I think it's because, like, Christoso, like, I used writing or reading to escape, and I read a ton of genre fiction. That's all I read was like dragon books, and someone tried to give me like a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'm like, where are the dragons? You know. And I finally actually kind of returned to I'm writing a sci-fi novel, Stephen. But yeah, I'm excited about it because there's spaceships and shit, you know. But yeah, I did. I was like 5 when I decided I was going to be a writer, and I have no idea why.
You know, I didn't answer very long. I just said I was going to be a farmer, so I'll answer longer here. It's totally random that I ended up being a writer because I went to college to be an archaeologist, and then that fell through. And then I was a philosophy major, and then I won an award for writing, and I thought, I can make A's in these classes. So I started taking writing classes. I could make A's. And then my professors convinced me to apply to grad school, and so I reluctantly did, and I applied to philosophy school, one philosophy school, and one writing school, and the writing school took me. So I'm a writer.
I always knew I was going to be a writer. I never wanted to be anything else. I wish I could say, gee, I did something useful in my life. I was an engineer, I was this or that. I've always just been a writer. That's it. And when my kids were growing up, you know, they never knew what they were going to be. And I'd say, what do you mean you don't know what you're going to be? You're 9 years old. You know, I knew when I was 9 years old I was going to be a writer. So, but it comes at different times to us, I think, as writers, where we begin to realize for one reason or another that we have this calling or whatever it is, or this urge to put our experiences and our thoughts and to just become involved in the things that we're interested in and write about them. I think with the goal probably of bringing other people into them and helping them to become interested in them as well. So as Native peoples, once you decide, okay, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to write now, did the other part come that, okay, I'm a Native person, I need to write about my experiences, my tribe, or you know, my legacy, my culture?
Yeah, that was my first book that came because the publisher, they told me it would sell better if I went by my family's name, Calf Looking, and I thought that sounds pretty cool, Stephen Calf Looking, you know. But and it would sell books definitely, like names that are exotic on the American shelf sell books, you know. But I could also have Jones, that was also my legal name, and I decided that it would be a bigger coup if I could get readers being a boring Jones than an exciting Calf Looking, you know. So I decided, because I do feel that anytime you I don't know about but anytime the market puts like an adjective in front of your name, that's the first step of dismissing you. And so I never wanted to be an Indian writer. I wanted to be a writer who is Indian, you know. And I always consider it a small victory when a reader or somebody comes to a book event and they're like, "Oh, you're Indian," and I'm like, "Yep," you know.
That's a really important point, and that goes back to what you were saying earlier, that you write out of who you are. And you don't want to be judged on, you know, oh, I'm an Indian writer, or I'm this kind of writer, I'm that kind of writer. You want to be judged for the work that you do, and it's got to be good across the board to everybody. So how about you, Chrysisto? Tell us about, I mean, did you think at some point, okay, I'm going to write, and I have this, obligation? Did you ever feel anything like that?
Well, I think the poetry that I write, I think most recently I started looking at my writing in a more historical way. So I started like looking at things that people didn't know much about in terms of Native American history. I wrote a poem about the mass hanging in Mankato, 1862. I found out that a whole lot of people didn't know about that event of Dakota people. There was 38 plus 2 that were hung, and it was considered the largest mass hanging in the United States by executive order of Abraham Lincoln. And when you tie a president to something like that, you know, people start to like, where'd you get this information from, you know? But that poem gave me a pushcart nomination. So I was kind of really excited about that, knowing that I can write about periods of time that, you know, people don't really know much about. The other one I use as a device are treaties. I'll go and do some research on treaties and look at the wording or look at the way that it's structured and try to make something out of it. You know, that's kind of, you know, out of the box. Because I think that there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, I have a voice now, and I might as well, you know, make some effort to educate people in the process.
But you know, what is fantastic about that is that, I mean, you're interested in this, and you're writing about it, and you're bringing it forth, but you're bringing it forth in a way that people understand what it means, the emotional component. You can go to the history books, and you can read about these different events, and about the Sioux uprising, and the what happened afterwards, which is just, I mean, that's horrendous. But the way you are able to write about it then has that emotional component that brings it home to people, where people say, what? You know, all of a sudden, it strikes their heart. Janice, how about you?
Well, I came of age as a writer in the 1970s, so I'm a generation older as a writer than these guys, and of course, during that period of time, there was a real effort by publishers to begin to look for women writers, and it didn't happen for Native American writers and Native women writers really until the 1980s. We had a whole spate of poetry and anthologies being published during that period of time. But when I got to graduate school in the 1980s, I guess, one of my professors gave me a book by Michelle Cliff called Claiming an Identity They Taught Me to Despise. And I was really moved by that book and really thought about the ways in which that despising of an identity erases it and problematizes it. And so I felt obligated in a sense to begin to give voice to the things that I experienced in my life. And as I said, you know, also to try and articulate some kind of history that's been just completely invisibilized in California. I mean, people think that California started under, you know, when Disneyland got developed or something, and so that whatever came before doesn't really count. But anyways, that's kind of where I was at. I don't know. Did I just answer that question?
I know it was so long ago that I forgot what question. No, the question was, yes, you did. Did you feel at some point, Erica, after you knew you were going to be a writer, and this is what did you feel that kind of draw, to write about your own culture, to bring it forth?
You know, I had a really interesting experience. I think I was kind of opposite of Stephen in the sense that I read, of course, all the Dragons and Stephen King and all that, and I was just going to write. It just didn't even occur to me at one point, even in as an undergrad, when half of my friends were Navajo at Fort Lewis, like, I'm never going to be in the Norton Anthology of British Literature. It did not occur to me or my friends, regardless of whether they're from like cities like Denver or the Navajo Reservation, and I still don't quite understand how that happened. And I think a lot about like how shame works in that way. Like my boyfriend, his mom is from Rosebud. She was always very proud of being Native. Her sister hid it to the point where her kids found her birth certificate and they were like, so I don't understand how that works. But I remember I took this workshop years ago with Junot Diaz. Apparently he's nicer now, I remember like all of it's a Voices Vona it's for writers of color, and there was like me and one other Indian, and we would high five in the hallways, and otherwise it was Latinas and mainly African Americans and African American women, and the workshop was mainly African American women and like a Latina and me and one Vietnamese dude from New Zealand, and what was fascinating is every single American, every single one of us said, we suddenly had to be like, why would my characters all be white? That's weird, why would I do that? And we asked Jeremy and he was like, well, no. He's like, I've always had some white characters and some Vietnamese characters because that's how I grew up. And it never occurred, and I thought, and that stuck with me for a long time. And I don't know what America does, although I have lots of billions of things to say about it. I'm not going to do that. But it does a good job of being like pushed down,
I'm going to open this now to questions. I'm sure many of you have questions for these wonderful authors. Yes?
My name's Lisa. So I'm very curious, as Robert Redford has bought the First Nations TV stations, and that national attention was centered very specifically at a certain time on Native peoples and water rights, and the shift in our culture to remember our colonization and how it didn't work out, and how that is, I see how there's sort of a whitewash on Indian culture and Native peoples, and that these are non-traditional ways of storytelling and such, and media exposure, etc. And I'm curious to what the panel thinks about that, as Stephen was saying earlier, with the sort of white guy wearing a t-shirt that has Native American, and I look at it as it's a bastardization for sure, but it's also bringing Native cultures to light. I mean, like the Native map of the United States, and like an Indian is not a person, is not a set of standardized amalgams. Yeah, and how we can help other people culturally to get that without being, I don't know, real concerned about them having or being super concerned. Do you see what I'm saying? A bit on the t-shirt thing, on the t-shirt kind of.
I think,
You know what I mean?
I think I have some sense of where you're going though.
Okay,
In
cool.
other words, you're basically saying, does some of this stuff at the pipeline, is it gonna matter in the larger culture, and is there gonna be
Absolutely.
more?
Absolutely.
I have a bitter thing to say,
Okay.
which is not surprising, if you know me on Facebook. And so, and you guys, know, essentially, like, once the pipeline thing hit, I do care about that. And I remember my agent was like, Erica, because he had failed to sell my Gangs novel. Everyone kept saying, all the rejections were like, it's too dark, it's just too dark, it's just too dark. And I'm like, do you want the musical version? I don't, it's about gangs. I don't know what they wanted, it's about gangs. And so he was like, Erica, if you'd write something nonfiction, because I'm always like, I was never a nonfiction person, but I was always solicited for it.
Right.
And so I've ended up writing it, even though I'm like, So I've written a lot of that, and he's like, well, if you'd write a nonfiction book, and I'm like, ugh. And so I was like, okay, what is the one thing I give any shits about? And it's the pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided, my boyfriend was actually helpful in this regard too. I was like, you know what? I'm gonna interview this guy named Huey Tweedy, who's a white farmer, because I've lived a lot of the last decade of my life in rural Illinois. And I'm okay, but I'm a little delicate inside because of it. But he lives near there, and the pipeline just shit on his life in a way that's indescribable. He fought it and 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 fought it, and literally almost gave up his life. Was ready to give up his life versus willingly take it. Then I was going to interview, and I did interview both of them, a woman named Elena Eagleshield, who was an educator who had a singularly interesting and not as loud and fabulous, but interesting experience on Standing Rock. And I put a proposal together, and my agent was like, I don't think I can sell this. And then some other agent was interested, and they were like, I'd really like more a story of reconciliation. And then another agent was interested, and they're like, I'd really more like a story of reconciliation. I realized, that's the one thing I actually can't do, is yet again, center white people and be like, here are these Indians in the background, and yet another white savior story. And I realized that's what they wanted. I'm like, I give up. I wish the answer to that was yes, but not in my experience. I hope something breaks through anyway.
With the t-shirt thing, I don't mind being on a t-shirt, of course, but I think the problem is that what gets stamped on the t-shirt is usually like the Redskin Profile. It's not just some dude standing by a cooler or something.
But you know what I'm saying. I'm not saying the t-shirt per se. I'm just talking about fashion. I'm talking about it's something that's reoccurring, I think, because at least to me, it's sort of like, oh man, we've really fucked this up. And how, we've gotten away from, nature being so important. And I mean, not in Boulder particularly, but in other areas of the country. And what I don't understand is like, with the Black Snake prophecy and things like that, and how people think that they're gonna drink water, and Arapahoes don't have clean water. I mean, there's so many places in the United States where people don't have clean water, but I'm saying, is First Nations TV helping? Is the pipeline, the experience of the pipeline, and people holding, I can't remember what I'm saying, but rise to power of taking back, taking back a culture to facilitate these things.
Yeah, hopefully that snowball gets big enough that we can then throw some reins on it and direct it where we want to direct it. That's ideal.
Questions? Anybody else? Yes. Mm-hmm.
What's one thing you'd like us to know?
What is one thing you would like us, non-native people, to know?
Anyone in the congregation.
Oh, maybe that we don't live in teepees, I guess. I get asked that. I go to places and they ask me that.
No, I mean about like one thing that you haven't been asked that you wish you'd been asked. That's a better way to ask the question.
As a writer or as a native person?
As a person.
Where do I want gift certificates to?
Does anybody Anybody else have questions?
Well-
Oh, I'm sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, that really is a question I would ask, but let me think. Question I would have asked. Where do I see Native American literature in 50 years, maybe? Does that mean I have to answer it now, though?
Think about that.
Think about it.
Yes, question over there? Yes.
I wanted to know, do you have any thoughts on the topic of reparations? I know this came up earlier with one of our panelists, Mr. Tarur, and I thought perhaps considering your position, you would also think of.
Any thoughts on reparations for Native
I
people?
do. I think I hear what I always hear are a lot of apologies, a lot of guilt, but never an offer to give me 1/8 of your land or something.
Money for your land. Yes.
The late Michael Doris said if the United States just kept any one of the treaties it ever signed, Indians would have a good day. And you know, it seems like that's where we could begin. And that would do a lot of help.
Yes. Anybody else? Yes. Go ahead.
I would like to hear what empowers you and what inspires you.
What empowers you and inspires you as writers?
I guess bad writing inspires me. 'Cause I think
I'm
I
talking
can,
about your own.
I think I can do better than that. You know, there's room for me in the world.
Anybody else want to talk about that? What empowers you? What inspires you?
I don't know, something that inspires me is even talking to my mom every day. You know.
Does that connect you? Do you feel that's a connection?
I think so. I mean, recently, because I've been having so many meaningful conversations with her that I didn't get to have when I was younger.
Yes. Okay. Question behind me. Question behind me here.
I think that we need to really go to the core of the problem. I think the mind has so much of power, and Indian issues or environmental issues, like writers, they are coming from the heart. They have such big minds that they can be harvested in a collective consciousness, raising the collective consciousness. And I don't know whether the native people have that edge collectively, that all of you think one item and how it can be going horizontal with the population that you have. To me, it is going to the core with a vision, an idea, and it can have immediate impact going horizontal with it. Thank you.
So what is? Do you have a question for them? Is it?
Well, I mean, I'm just saying that if that can be used as a technique to get the awareness in a collective consciousness.
I like that idea, it's really beautiful, but the problem is I think it's so big. And so I don't know how to address it. And so I think, for example, I am thinking a lot about like Native American genre literature lately and what it can do that like traditional Native literature not necessarily can't do, but hasn't done. And I'm reading, actually I was on this radio show called Lumpin' in Chicago the other day. And I was saying, you know, people need to read Blake Houseman and Daniel Wilson and Stephen Graham Jones and, you know, all these sci-fi and or horror Native writers. And the guy was like, what? Because Stephen Graham Jones and Daniel Wilson, they're some of my favorite writers, but I didn't know they were Indian. And, you know, so I felt that happiness, you know. But I'm just going to keep on supporting writers like that. Rebecca Roanhorse, she's a fantasy writer. She got a 2-book deal with Simon & Schuster. That's not happened in a long time for Native writers, right out of the gate. And so I'm just going to continue to celebrate these smaller things and endorse them.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really thinking in terms of specific writers, although I mentioned a couple, Linda Hogan and Robin Kimmerer. But I think in terms of, if I understand your comment, I think Native people, I think ideally, Native people do come from the heart, and we think in the terms of these four parts of us: the mind, the body, our emotions, and our spirits. And it's looking for those connections that has been the traditional way. So when people, for example, think about how to sustainably harvest a forest, they're thinking in terms of those relationships. How do you maintain the relationships with those trees? How do you keep the oldest trees alive? That's what you do. And so I think that I think the best writing for me comes out of that kind of that place that brings us together, whether it's Indian people or all of us. That we need that. We need that more than ever right now to understand. If you want a message, as you questioned, we say all our relations, and that's because it still has meaning for us. And if it had meaning for all of us, we'd have a better world. That's